Hi, everybody, and welcome to our office hours. Andrew Rizkala and Corinne Hansen here. I am VP of Sustainability from Green Places, and we're running a webinar today on office hours for CDP submission and updates, some important updates this year. Riz, is it okay if I let you introduce yourself, and then I'll dive into some introductions of our topics today?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for the invite and thanks for having me here today, Corinne and team. Um, I am the ESG delivery lead at MorganFranklin. I've been there about 4 years. We're a full kind of accounting, finance, technology firm. We help clients across the life cycle from emerging growth to large public enterprise clients with a number of challenges. But for my part, focusing on ESG program maturity. That ranges from standing up programs to optimizing programs, supporting leaders with things like reporting to the CDP, and also, preparing for the regulations that are coming in a lot of different jurisdictions that companies operate in. So really happy to be here today.
Excellent. Riz, thank you so much for being here with us today. And before I go through the agenda, folks, feel free to weigh in on the chat. You can tell us where you're dialing from and also tell us your favorite place to visit. Just get to know each other a little bit, try to make these webinars a little warmer. It's tough we're always on Zoom these days.
That's
Um,
true.
that's true. And so a little background on myself, I've been in the sustainability space for over 12 years now. And I've really focused on helping companies and firms integrate ESG into their core business strategies. So as VP of Sustainability at Green Places, I oversee our carbon accounting team and support our clients with comprehensive sustainability strategies, their efforts to decarbonize and meet sustainability goals while growing their core businesses. So thank you so much again, Riz, for being here with us today. I see some folks starting to weigh in on the chat. Excellent. So before we dive into our session, I want to provide a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We're trying to keep our agenda fairly light so that we leave lots of time for Q&A. I think the most productive use of our time today is to be able to dig in and ask questions and work together to understand these changes to CDP. So our agenda today is designed to equip you with the current information on CDP, but then really to focus on that open forum. So we'll do a couple of polls to level set across the group. We'll dive into a quick CDP overview and we'll review the changes to reporting in CDP. And then we'll get to the meat of the webinar, which is our open forum. So question of the day, do you currently report to CDP? And so we should see a pop-up here on your screen. Yes, no, I don't know. And feel free to share any specific challenges that you're grappling with as a company in the chat. Has this question come up over and over again? Maybe the answer is no, but the context is that we talk about it annually. Maybe the context is yes, but we try to quit annually. I've heard all sorts from all different folks. Wow, okay. So I hope that everyone can see the results of the poll on your end. We've got 60% for yes, 30% for no, and 1% for I don't know, which is always interesting. There's so many different things going on in each company, and sometimes reporting is at least one person's whole job. That makes sense that we've got folks in the room who are interested in CDP because this is what you are currently working on or plan to be working on. And so our next poll, if you've reported to CDP or are planning to, what's the driving force? Why are you deciding to do so? Are you reacting to client pressure, investor pressure, strategic business advantages that you want to seek out from leveraging CDP? Is it all of the above or none of those, something else? I can say that I personally have worked with clients across all of these concerns, and maybe one of the most impactful is that investor pressure side of things that folks want to be able to compare, and certainly the origins of CDP, we're working with investors. So curious to see if that's still floating to the top. Oh, none for investor pressure.
Interesting.
Uh, yeah, that is interesting. Lots of client pressure, some
Mm,
concerns around strategic business advantage. I suppose all of the above will encapsulate some of the investor pressure.
yeah.
Um, but I imagine with regulatory framework starting to peak, we're seeing less of a focus on investors pressuring on CDP. So that does make sense. Great. So a little bit of background on CDP and its relevance in the space. CDP first started by sort of piggybacking off of GRI's concepts of environmental disclosure in 2002. It focused on individual companies rather than nations originally. And at the time, they had just 35 investors signing requests for climate information and about 245 companies who were responding. Um, and as of 2022, companies worth half of the global market cap disclosed through CDP, and about 24,000 organizations disclosed in CDP in 2023. So one of the reasons that we're focusing on this, and certainly one of the reasons that you as companies are concerned with CDP, is that there is a huge focus on it. It's really taken off in the space. And so we'll talk a little bit about why that is and what value adds CDP has today. And so with that, I'm going to hand off to Riz to start walking through some of those elements of CDP.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. Obviously, CDP's come a long way since 2002. They even dropped the longer moniker Climate Disclosure Project. They want to be more hip, I think. So it's just CDP now, and it really is, in my opinion, the de facto standard for company environmental reporting. They've got climate, water, biodiversity, and some circular economy information as well by way of their plastics questionnaire. So um, what's what I think is a driver and where they're trying to go is supply chain engagement for companies to request information from their suppliers. It's really driving an uptick in participation in the CDP. If you look at a graph of the number of disclosures, it's exponential and really has gone up quickly in the last, I'd say, 4 years. Um, so since these really big companies have set ambitious pledges for action against environmental targets, they're now engaging their suppliers to help them reach those goals. And when I speak with clients and customers about the CDP, there's usually a large customer or key investor, as you mentioned, that's requested that they responded. I haven't personally encountered a company that's kind of doing it as their own strategic initiative, but I believe they're out there. So that's kind of why I think we're seeing such an increase here. And so big changes this year with the CDP. So there's a brand new unveiled single integrated questionnaire. So it used to be disparate, kind of different questionnaires for, as I mentioned, like forest, water, climate, and a number of those questions in the different questionnaires would be a little bit repetitive. So they overhauled the entire platform. They're now collecting data across all of those topic areas, and companies have the ability to select, drop downs for specific questions around their responses and how those relate to specific topic areas. So that really was a major modernization and improvement. Also, the look and feel of the questionnaire is very different this year, and it's definitely taken a little bit of getting used to, speaking from experience. So but I believe that a lot of the improvements related to increased visibility and transparency in the long run will be powerful for companies. So things that you see here on the screen related to more breakdowns for the emissions, specifically around scope 1 and 2, being able to break down by customers, by facility, by geo. There's a lot more different capability that's now provided to disclosures. And you see also, better alignment with targets and transition planning. There's more of a focus on this 1.5 degree C target, and whether companies, like really explicitly asking companies if they have a target that is aligned, and if it's not aligned, why, and getting companies to really hopefully take more steps, because that is what we need globally, is more action. And then with the carbon credits and offsetting, I think there's this used to be a small piece of the climate questionnaire, but it's really expanded. And because this is what investors are asking about. If you look at like recent regulatory changes and the SEC climate disclosure rule, like investors want to know about renewable energy credits, and they want to know about carbon offsets and the purchases of these types of vehicles, because there's potential, balance sheet impact as well.
Yeah, I'll leave that for now because I imagine we'll get questions on the carbon offsetting piece, but there's certainly been a lot with CDP, SBTI, concerns around, how do we apply this strategy we've been using through the history of our sustainability strategies? Does this still apply if we're going to be responsive to the new order and pressure to decarbonize? And what role does offsetting continue to play? So thank you for touching on that.
So thought we'd provide a couple screenshots so people can see, what does this really look like? And if, for the folks that answered yes, we're doing this, you may be familiar. Obviously, we're getting close to the closing date here, but this is kind of the dashboard view that you have now as a disclosure to be able to see your progress and the questions you've answered. And you can also, you can add multiple people. Like, it really fosters more collaboration because people can work in real time on different sections. And you can have reviewers and, primary editors. And it really feels more like a SaaS tool than it did in the past. And also, as mentioned, like some of those breakdowns of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, there's enhanced visibility now and requests to disclose against specific things like the geography where you operate, et cetera. So just wanted to put a couple of those screens in here. Now, I think we would be remiss not to talk about some of the portal challenges that have occurred. Obviously, new modern portal unveiled this year, very exciting, but there have been some challenges. So some of those challenges related to user friendliness of the platform, actually being able to type data into some of the responses has been difficult. There was this weird bug where you couldn't put the cursor exactly where you wanted to put it. And so you basically had to draft everything somewhere else and then copy and paste it in. If you wanted to edit it, you had to go back out. Obviously not the spirit of what they were hoping to accomplish here, but with some recent improvements, there was some downtime in August, and right around the time that they pushed the date back for disclosure, they released an update, and some of these items have been fixed, so that's good. Plan downtime related to the ability to submit cases, if you had some issues and you were looking to get help, that wasn't working. And then there was issues with the portal itself and being able to access that. So again, I think as a response, the CDP has extended the disclosure window, which is really, I think the right thing to do for people, so that they don't, feel overwhelmed and overly frustrated by this process. And then finally, I think the import and export functionality, the goal, especially for some of those long list questions, like you saw, emissions by geography or emissions by facility. Imagine you have hundreds of facilities. You don't want to key that into the portal directly. It'd be better to be able to import that. And that is their plan, to be able to do that via an Excel or Sheets, spreadsheet import. But the initial functionality there was very buggy. So we're very hopeful that that gets fixed in the midterm. I just put a couple, examples of some of the email communication, and to their credit, I think the CDP has done a decent job of communicating what's going on to users of the platform. So, but it has not been all, rainbows and sunshine for them this summer. So,
yeah, I think the takeaway is especially for an organization like CDP, we're all in this together. They've been on the forefront of trying to drive climate disclosure and modernizing and figuring out ways to make that work, consolidating questionnaires, updating the platform, making sure that they're being responsive to demands around target setting and carbon offsets. Like that's well reflected. And it's a challenging space. And with regulatory frameworks now pushing into the space and asking for something to be codified and unified, having a simpler way to disclose is really necessary. And I think we're still kind of struggling to see that. It's every year that we've got to figure out workarounds to develop spreadsheets to track the questionnaires itself so that we can fill things out and get it ready and track year-on-year progress. And that sort of ease of use is still missing entirely from the space, not just from CDP. Is something that we'd like to see. So, we've asked folks to please drop questions into the chat. And so I'll pull our Q&A open here, but just to sort of kick us off, I think we touched on a couple of key points, and Riz, thanks for that walkthrough. And I think, to start us high level, maybe, would you speak a little bit to the way that CDP is evolving to meet the growing needs of businesses trying to navigate their ESG journeys? I think you touched on a couple of key points here, but I'm sure there's a lot more you'd like to say.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think modernization and scaling their platform to be able to handle the huge amount of companies that are now disclosing and fostering more of that connectivity between the requester and the discloser for that supply chain engagement is really, I think, where they're going. Like, we're going to enter a world, I mean, I believe this, we're going to enter a world where functionally every company is going to have to track their emissions. And so being able to do that and for companies to understand their scope 3 boundary and to, consume data from their supply chain partners, you need a platform that can handle the volume of information that's going to take. And so I think that was a really, we, on the front end here, looking at the portal, talk about things like user friendliness and specific functionality, but I think the back end improvements for them were probably more impactful to be able to achieve that mission of, scaling the transparency and the visibility of this action that is occurring, by all of these companies, because we're all trying to, solve climate change, and it's the biggest problem out there. So
yeah, absolutely. Maybe one more question for me, and then I'll kick over to some of the questions that are starting to roll in. What about sort of the maturity curve of companies who've been responding to CDP? What role do you see them playing or the framework playing along that line for companies starting out in their journey to super sophisticated companies who maybe also have regulatory requirements? What role does responding to CDP play in those various realms?
yeah, look, I mean, if you're just getting started with the CDP, there are a lot of questions, and it can be very overwhelming and frankly terrifying, because your answers to many questions will be, I don't know, or that's not applicable. But I think it's important still to respond and to select those answers, because the CDP wants to understand where companies are at in their maturity curve of their ESG program, right? So there's companies that are just getting started. There's companies that may have been doing things for a couple years. Maybe they've been measuring a footprint. Maybe they just started measuring footprint because they were asked by an investor or a customer to do it. But maybe they don't have like really refined governance processes, or maybe they haven't integrated, climate related risks into their strategy. I want to just say that's okay to say that, right? What you don't want to do is like leave questions blank necessarily, because I think it's important. And if you look at prior years reporting, you'll see some of the outputs from the CDP that where they're tracking, and sharing like globally, publicly, how are we doing? Where are companies today? How many companies have set targets that align with the 1.5 degrees C, goal, or how many companies have executive oversight of an ESG program, right? There's so many. It's hard to undersell like how important this information is for people and for other companies for benchmarking, to figure out what they should be doing and where they should be going. So I really think like not leaving answers blank is what I always tell clients and customers is the goal, if you haven't done it yet, that's okay, explain, right? There's always a box that says, please explain. And,
Exactly.
putting some discussion in there about like where you're at in your journey. To take a client as an example, like, um, had a customer that they wanted to disclose, they had just completed materiality assessment. So they understood what their kind of big ESG risks and levers and topics would be. They were asked to disclose by a large customer. They went through the process of doing a greenhouse gas footprint like that same year, for a prior year in order to have the data to do the disclosure. Great first step. But there was a lot of answers to questions in that first year that were essentially, we don't know that yet. Do you have a climate transition plan? No, not really. We just figured out our footprint. We don't know how we're going to reduce it. Have you set targets or goals? No, not really. We just figured out our footprint, right? Like there's ways to respond in like an honest and transparent way, but also that explains where you're at, and you can still get a good score doing that. Is the important thing.
Mhm.
Like, you can demonstrate you have some awareness of what's happening and that you're making investments to get to where you want to go. So I hope that answers the question, but it's important to like show the process as much as it is to like respond to the specific questions.
Yeah, I think that's so right. I think CDP various leadership has been on record a number of times saying that they um, developed the framework with the intent of driving progress and not punishing people who are starting out in their journeys. And I think that's held relatively true. Um, so we've got questions in two places. Please feel free to just drop them directly in the webinar chat if that's easiest for you, or you can drop them in the Q&A. We'll see them at either location. No worries. Trying to figure out some functionality of Zoom is not the point of this webinar. But I'll just start with the Q&A real quick. Tactical question. I heard you keep your score private for the first submission. Is that true? And what are the limits around that? Do you want to kick us off and I can layer in?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is that is true. You can keep your score private. There's a little checkbox at the end of the questionnaire as to whether you want to, make that public or not. If you've been requested to disclose by another, like a customer or then they will get, the specific response. But it doesn't necessarily need to go onto the like website for anybody to be able to look up. I Again, my opinion and what I counsel people is that I do think making your score, public is the right thing to do. Because again, it's not that you'll be punished per se, but it shows other companies what you're doing and you're able to see what other companies are doing. And so it really fosters that kind of openness and transparency. But I can understand year one if, it's been a ad hoc process and effort to put those responses together that, looking to refine in subsequent years and making, the choice to go public in subsequent years could make sense.
Yeah, I've often advised companies to treat your first year submission to CDP like a 2-year endeavor, that you want to kind of do a shadow exercise, figure out what you have and don't have, and start to gather it so that you're starting from a stronger base rather than using it to just figure things out. Because it is a disclosure project, it is intended to be publicly disclosed. First year, you keep things private, but then you're expected to disclose in year two. And while CDP has provision around making adjustments, you can request to keep your score private for a longer period of time. I have no examples of anyone ever actually needing that. And I've reached out on behalf of clients 1 or 2 times, and they're always like, it's extremely rare that we would do this, and they don't provide additional detail about when and why. So I think that the expectation should be, this is a public exercise. This is something that we're using to disclose externally, and rightly so. We've got a question in the chat here. I'd like to better understand the water security portion. This area is required now for us per CDP and hasn't been in the past. We're not in manufacturing. I'm unclear on how to answer these questions when the only water use we have is day-to-day office plumbing.
Yeah, understood. I think that can be frustrating to be, asked to report data that you don't have. Um, I would say that in this kind of first pass on this, it might be reasonable to say we don't have access to that. We haven't tracked that in the reporting year, and given that it's something that is required now for you, you may want to put some processes in place here, before the end of like this year to start to figure out, if you can get that information. And it's reasonable that, water may not have been a material topic to your, leadership team or to your ESG council or however your governance is stood up. But this is a data point that may influence, the decision making in the future on the materiality of this topic. If you're being required to track and report information on something that you don't currently track or, measure, then it stands to reason that you may want to build some processes for that in the future. But I think, for this current year and for this cycle, to get straight to the question here, I think responses like, that's not something we've been directed to do by our board. It's not a material topic under our paradigm. You may have locations in drought-stricken regions where, like facilities or offices, where maybe there is a risk of the increase of water, but if it's not a material expenditure under, your company, then, that's basically the answer. So I think I have this idea about like you have to be able to defend your position, right? As to if you're not going to respond or if you don't have the data, like why, and why could just be, well, we've never been asked before, but also that means that it hasn't been material until now.
Right.
So I think that's how I would kind of go about that.
Yeah, a lot's been said about in the sustainability industry and over-indexing on carbon, which is sort of funny to think about because, there was a big call for unification of disclosure topic and for us to have something that's directly comparable across industries, across companies, and carbon and CO2e is it, carbon equivalencies. So using carbon as the building block for understanding sustainability, I do stand behind. And I understand that in over indexing and focusing on carbon across every disclosure framework, we lose biodiversity, water, waste, like we lose an understanding of other environmental impact factors that are critical to the health of our ecosystems. And so the intent of consolidating the questionnaires and including requests for information across wider topics is a good one. The intent is to get companies to think critically about exposure to water consumption wider than just what's read on your meter. And if you have done that exercise and have looked through your supply chain and said, we're really not consuming water, or we aren't tracking that, but we will track it next year, like that is an acceptable answer. I think that I would expect a lot of not applicables in this year, and a lot of rationalizing why it's not applicable to you. But do go through that exercise. Think about, are we purchasing something that consumes a ton of water? Even if we're not in manufacturing, is there at the end user product, does it involve a lot of consumption of water? Are we tracking that at all? Do we have any policies around that? Do we even have an awareness of what that looks like? Have we done footprinting across the company? And if the answer is no, then put not applicable and put that thought process. Because I do expect there will be revisions to the questionnaire, what's applied, what's not applied. And you can't have something that is somewhat uniform without there being things that are not applicable to you as a company. Next question. Can you please talk about a recommended approach for professional services firms, LLPs rather than LLCs?
Yeah, I guess my interpretation of this is kind of your boundaries of your organization, and so related to, what entities are responding and the data for those entities. So it's important in that kind of first organizational definition section of the questionnaire where you describe like and also in the business strategy a little bit, but you'll describe like what does the firm do and where does it operate and how does it operate, and I think that's where you can either, if you have exclusions, if you're not reporting at like a total, like whole company holding level, if you're gonna have specific subsidiary that's reporting, or if you're reporting, some subsidiaries, but you don't have data for other subsidiaries, that's where you want to draw out kind of the boundary lines for your reporting and explain, and then be consistent through the rest of the questionnaire. Like if there's certain offices that are not responding, or you don't have data for certain offices, make sure that you continue to exclude any emissions or water use or anything else related to those offices as you go.
Yeah, and I see a clarification, more concerned about the governance question, but I think you did satisfy that in the answer. That's also my interpretation. Does CDP provide any guidance regarding industry benchmarking? Every company is so unique and have individual boundaries around what is included. So many clients ask us to benchmark them against others in the industry.
Yeah, this is a common question I get as well. And I think I usually ask, well, what are the companies that you directly compare yourself to? And if they're public, you can go find that in the K, but otherwise, they may have like, hey, we look at, XYZ company, and then I'll go check and see if they've done disclosure before, specifically like those competitors. But there are like specific industry, like agriculture and others, that have more detailed guidance and more detailed questions. So depending on what industry you're in, there is a lot of additional guidance. But for, I would say, companies that, have a light environmental footprint, relatively, um, it's usually just go and check what are your competitors doing.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are still a lot of asks in the field for like an easy way to compare. And I think that CDP gets close using carbon equivalency to track across an industry and see carbon intensity and see intensity targets is helpful comparison. Um, and certainly like the guidance about what's material and not material to you by industry is just like another layer, like any of the voluntary frameworks are, of understanding why you would choose to include something or not include something as a company. And when I was doing materiality assessments as a core part of my work, we draw on GRI, SASB, CDP, like those were sort of the three top frameworks to start to say what is the leading guidance on what's included as material to your industry or your if you're sort of a unique blended company, your combination of industries. Caitlin calling in from LA. I've been with my company now for only a few months as their sustainability manager. Welcome. Although I'm personally new to CDP reporting, my company has completed CDP reporting in previous years. However, this year's report has many new questions that were not in the previous year's report, so I'm struggling with how to answer some of these newer questions. Constantly facing the I don't know. Do you have any recommendations on tools, resources I could use to help me respond to questions that I'm unsure about?
Yeah, this is Caitlin, welcome, and you're not alone. There are a lot of new questions. So a few ideas for you. Some clients that I work with have, they will respond to like RFPs, or they'll have customer requests come through, and they may keep a log of answers to some of those requests that they've gotten in the past. So that might be a place to go and see if there is some overlap between the newer questions you're being asked and some questions that maybe other customers have asked you in the past. Otherwise, I don't know, is an acceptable response, I mean, we're in this place where we're trying to respond for a prior year, right? So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of like governance items, specific roles and responsibilities for people on task forces, or like there was a huge expansion of the different number of types of risks and opportunities and things that you could consider as part of your overall risk profile, and trying to quantify those items. I know that that is very difficult and not necessarily something you should try to do in retrospect either. So I think being honest and saying we don't have a quantified, value for this risk, at this point. That's what you have to do. And I think it should be instructive for the future. I think some of these questions will stay around. So keeping track of those questions that we didn't have a response to this year, and how are we going to get a response for next year, before next year, right? So you've got a few
Mhm.
months here, is kind of the key. So what changes do we need to make to our org structure, if any? Do we need to make changes to the business strategy? Are there new risks we should be considering, right? This is kind of the time, I would say, after the disclosure window closes, because that's probably the number one priority right now. But after that, would be the time to figure out how we can make it better.
Yeah, absolutely. The CDP of all of the frameworks, really, the CDP certainly follows the trajectory of policy. Do you have a policy in place? The data, what are you tracking? Evidence, and then the implementation, outcomes side of things. And so for each topic, you're sort of tracing that. And so a lot of the questions that are new are include all of those components. So taking those aside and saying we don't have answers for these, we're not tracking anything against it, gives you a roadmap for what you need to do in this next year. And that's really the intent of any of these frameworks you disclose, so that it's public, comparable, transparent, but then you have something to work from, guidance to bring in-house and say, we didn't have this policy in this year. We expect it'll be on the docket next year. So let's make sure that we develop something around it and then show how we're implementing it year on year. So just echoing you on that for sure. That it should be both disclosure and actionable exercise is the desired outcome here.
And I'll just add,
Please.
and I'm sure you're using this, but the guidance toolbar in the portal is very helpful, very useful. And there's oftentimes also external links to additional supplementary guidance that you can dig into depending on the question. So don't sleep on the guidance. I live in that. So.
And I see Kristen plugging our ebook about your first 90 days in sustainability. Some good resources there, generally speaking, if you're deciphering terms and trying to get a lay of the land, figuring out how to prioritize, definitely super useful. I'm curious, Riz, about your thoughts on the most significant changes to CDP reporting process this year, especially in terms of data collection and methodology. We talked through the widest range of them, but what's making the biggest impact?
I don't think this is the answer you want, but what's taken the most time for me is keying in all the rows of facilities. That's just that was a bug that really impacted me. But I think the reorganization of, because there used to be a separate targets, section, and there was a separate, there was emissions data and there was emission methodology section. It's all blended together into this performance section, and that section has been a real bear to complete. I wouldn't say at least 50% of the responses are in that one section, depending on, again, what scope of your response is in scope, and whether you've clicked yes or no to each of the different climate, water, forests, etc. So there's just a lot of data requested, but I think it's really good. I mean, for, again, all of us that want to be able to benchmark and want to be able to figure out what are the levers we should be pulling in order to make smart decarbonization decisions. This is what we need to be doing. But it's definitely, it's burdensome. I'm glad they gave us 2 more weeks. I needed it.
Yeah. No, coming from the perspective of a software company, it's extremely relatable. The challenges around just uploading and exporting location-based information is a challenge. Making sure that it's digested properly is complex, more complex than you would think it is.
I had to go
And
key
extremely
in
necessary.
latitude and longitude for every facility too, which is a whole evening of just looking up, facilities on Google Maps. I mean, that there's just little things like that I'm hoping there's a better way to do that. Well, they should be carried over year over year going forward. So hopefully that's not a huge problem in the future.
You've done your penance there.
Yeah.
Um, can you elaborate a little bit on the expanded questions around methodologies? Like what exactly is CDP trying to capture with this deeper dive? I think we talked about consolidation and a couple of other things, but you speak a little bit to the intent of this transition.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in the past it was like reasonably simple. I mean, you would go through, let me speak about climate. You would go, scope 1, 2, and 3, category by category, and then define whether it was relevant or not to your business and what like protocol or standard you use to make that definition. And there was some free text about, how you came to that conclusion. Um, that's all still there. It's a little bit expanded in terms of like what assumptions and things that you're making for each of those categories. And I think it's up to the companies to kind of share their methodology, right? And I will plug, Green Places because you guys do a really good job of when you prepare an emissions inventory for a company, like showing all of the calculation steps, which then become very important for the disclosure itself. So I mean, I was looking at something today that was, for fuel consumption, did you use the high heating value or the low heating value for this, specific type of feedstock? And there's just like a lot of layers of things that you want to be able to share. And so having that, background from the emissions inventory that you've done is useful for those questions. And again, it's okay if you don't know to say you don't know, but if you can get the answer, I always try to get the answer.
Excellent. Jen, I see you retyped your question on water security portion. If you want a clarification on some component of that, feel free to add a little more detail and we can definitely make sure we respond to that. So maybe while you're doing that, um, okay, great. Copy paste error. Totally understandable. Extremely relatable. Um,
Very
very relatable. Um, oh, excellent. Um, I think a lot of companies are just starting out in their CDP responses still, and I'm curious about like the initial hurdles. And if I try to think back to early advice I'd give to companies, and I'd love to see folks chime in, just like when you're doing your first submission, what are some of the things to be wary of? What are the biggest hurdles to data collection? What are the biggest hurdles to getting your responses together? What are the trouble areas that folks should be aware of, let's say if they're thinking about submission for next year? And that's to you too, Riz. Like, what are your thoughts on like what advice have you provided um, to companies who are starting out, and like what do you wish that you'd known, or what do you try to tell folks that they should know in their first year?
definitely. I think when you're just starting, one of the toughest things to articulate, but also one of the most important things is your business operations and its strategy and where you fit, where you think you fit in kind of this hierarchy of organizations. Um, and I guess to be like more explicit about that, um, it's very reasonable that, climate related risks may not have impacted your strategy, or maybe you haven't made any financial decisions based on risks that you may or may not have assessed at this point. But I think when you're just getting started, like you're learning what the test is so that you can figure out what your answers to the test need to be. And then you can go educate. Like if you're just getting started in sustainability, or if you have sustainability um, responsibility of your company, you're going to have to do a lot of education um, across your organization, up to your leadership team, up to your board potentially, about why is this important? What does it mean? How could it impact the company, right? And I think you mentioned earlier, Corinne, SASB did such an amazing job early on connecting specific sustainability topics to balance sheet impact or cost of capital
Hmm.
or any other number of like specific accounting terms that people like, especially in finance, can like understand. And I think that's beyond important so that you can speak like two languages, really, to be able to speak that, finance, accounting language, but also the climate sustainability language. So scroll through the list of potential risks, like take a look at, try to just like brainstorm, like how could this impact our operations? We had to tell another story, we had a customer that had had an office in South Florida, and it experienced flooding in the reporting year. And nobody, I think, had made any connection that flooding could have been connected to climate change. That the storm that caused that may have been made more powerful and more acute because of like warm seawater temperature. And so I think you sometimes have to be the connector to help people see those things. So
Yeah, that's a really good
that's my
point.
advice.
Excellent. I've got one more question for you, sort of on a similar topic. So, and then I think we'll probably steer toward wrapping up. If folks have any other questions, feel free to drop them in. We'll definitely make time for those. But you talking about being a connector made me think of discussions you and I have had on CARB and partnership with CDP, the California Air Resources Board. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, just sort of what implications does a partnership there maybe have for companies reporting under both frameworks, and what can folks expect in terms of trying to find alignment there?
Yeah, well, I think so this year CDP did a lot to ensure that the questionnaire was aligned with the ISSB frameworks for climate. And, the state of California late last year released these laws that now have been kind of clarified a little bit this year for climate related risk reporting and separately emissions reporting. And so you mentioned CARB. CARB by law has the authority to kind of execute on these missions to collect this data, but it's written in law that they can utilize a third-party system to do this. And I think they also have the option to like leverage a California State University, which that would be great for California. But I think the CDP is so well established, it makes sense to me as an observer that utilizing CDP to collect this data, these annual reports or biannual reports that companies are now going to be required to make, would be a really good step. So we'll see how that unfolds. That's kind of my prediction, but I don't have any insider information. I'm just a guy out here, so we'll see.
Well, I think you're much more than a guy. I think you've been extremely helpful in laying out for us the differences to be expected around CDP, and I've really appreciated our conversations leading up to this, and of course today. So thank you, Riz, so much for providing your expertise here, and it's always lovely to chat with someone else who's in the weeds on this and other reporting frameworks. So
Oh
thank
yeah,
you for
a lot
being
of
here.
weeds.
A
Thanks for
lot of
having
weeds
me.
to
I
be had
really
here.
appreciate it. Yeah.
Of course. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have other questions, please feel free to follow up with us. We'll of course send a follow up, and you can connect with us using this QR code. We'll send a follow up by email as well. You can reach out to us, find us on LinkedIn, both at Group Places or at MorganFranklin, or us individually. Happy to answer any other questions, and always happy to provide some input on CDP. Thanks,
Absolutely.
everybody. Have a great rest of your week.